There's no question that agriculture is important, vital to the well-being of communities throughout the world. I think we all agree that food is a basic human need. Agricultural production will need to grow by 60% by the year 2050 in order to feed the world's growing population. And they estimate that the growth rate needs to be 100% in developing markets. And these figures don't include using crops as food stock or feedstock for biofuels. 3/4 of the world's poorest people get their food and income from farming small plots of land. And more than 500 million family farms produce 80% of the world's food. And another 290 million people get their livelihoods from the agricultural value chain. So we'll need more food to feed more people in the coming years. With limited resources, land and water are limited. And another resource that's needed is capital to invest in the productivity requirements that are needed. And capital is limited also. My name is Richard Fahey, and I work for the Skoll Foundation. And I have the privilege of association with two organizations that provide capital that result in these productivity improvements in the agricultural sector. Capricorn Investment Group and the Foundation's Social Entrepreneurship Program. Capricorn invests in for-profit enterprises, and the Foundation's SASE program invests in nonprofits. So I have wondered, and you might wonder also, if you haven't already, you probably are now, which has the greater impact? The investment in for-profits or nonprofits? So the question, the way that I frame this, and I think you see it, is in terms of social return on investment. And I'm just defining that not any further than in terms of food security, income generation, and resource sustainability. I've asked a couple people over the last few years to research this, take a look at Capricorn's investments, consider the investments that the foundation has through grants, but everybody's too busy, they don't have time to do it. So I thought, why don't we ask the experts, the practitioners? So I put it out to them, and they said, bring it on. So we also had the idea to use it a debate format rather than a panel. And I found out in doing this that in, I think it's 11 years, 12 years of the Skoll World Forum, there's never been a debate for whatever reason. And as we prepared for this, there was a little bit of, well, this is a false dichotomy because we need for-profits, we need nonprofits, we need the government. Yeah, that's all true. But they were up for it. So I'm going to have the debaters introduce themselves in a moment. But somebody needs to decide who wins. And there will be a non-winner. I don't want to say a loser. There'll be a second place.
Will the funding go away?
Yeah. You know, I haven't decided on the outcomes. Yeah, I haven't decided on the outcomes yet. So you guys are going to decide. So I'd like you to vote right now with a show of hands, for-profit or non-profit. We'll listen to the cases. There'll be a rebuttal. We'll take another vote, and the side that has swayed votes toward it will be victorious. Okay?
What if I want to vote for both?
This is based on something.
State the question really clearly.
Yeah, no, okay.
Metric. What do we measure?
Yeah, I'm not going to go any further. You got to take what I say. Social return on investment in terms of food security, income generation, or resource sustainability. Okay, that's pretty general, but that's a social return on investment. And one side does that and generates financial return, and the other side, let's say, doesn't return capital to the investor. So let's go with that. Suspend disbelief, if you will. Let's have a show of hands. Say you had $1 million, and you actually had to make the choice. No, you may not. We got to get on with the debate. You're not debating.
Why can't we do both? One maximization profit, the other one optimization.
That's in another room. This is the world. These guys, they made decisions. They made
They're not the world.
Let's see how you're going to vote me, Chai. We're in this world now. A show of hands. Who would put your $1 million in for-profits? I've asked some people to help me count. Oh, I think it's going to be eat.
Tough work. Ouch.
Notice I'm raising my right hand.
Okay, yeah, I know. So we're not going to be able. Did you guys count?
Yeah.
15. Okay, nonprofits. Nonprofits. Up high, up high.
And now it's my left hand, symbolically.
Okay, how many people are in the room?
Everybody gets like.
It's even. It's basically even.
Okay, great. Did you guys count?
About 18 or 19.
How many?
Same number.
Same number.
Okay, let's start.
Yeah. 22. Let's count at the end.
So, would you guys introduce yourselves real quickly? Just go down the line, starting with Alan, and then we'll start. We're going to have about a 5 minute to make their case individually, and then there'll be a rebuttal, and then we'll vote again. And then I thought leaving the last 15 minutes for open discussion. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So a quick introduction. My name is Alan Chang. I'm a partner with Capricorn Investment Group. I've been on the board of Suminta India Organics, and I focus and manage our investments in the emerging markets as well as venture capital.
And I'm Ion Yadigoroglu, also Capricorn, representing another investment of ours called Agrica, which is a staples farm, largely a rice farm in the center part of Tanzania. And so in both of our cases, we are very active board members talking about the company we've invested in. We felt that would be more objective than the CEO talking about their own company. So we decided to start with very high standards of objectivity.
As opposed to the opponents?
Yes.
Yeah, could we hear from a CEO now? The debate hasn't started yet.
Don't let them slide.
My name is Willie Foote. I'm an employee of Root Capital. And we are an impact-first agricultural lender, and we invest in agricultural businesses that build sustainable livelihoods for small-scale farmers across sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and most recently in Indonesia, because I understand it's a really good time to work in Indonesia from lunch.
My name is Andrew Yoon. I wash the dishes at One Acre Farm. I'm not a capitalist pig.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. We flipped a coin. It was Queen Elizabeth, or I don't know what it is, a dragon, or on the other side. And the for-profits won, and I believe Jan is going to make the opening case. You can use the podium, but you don't have to.
Richard, there's a reason why there has never been a debate at the Skoll World Forum.
We're
about
going
to find out why. No, and by the way, that is, on the more serious note, it would be wonderful to have someone like Carter Coleman, who is in fact CEO of Agrica here. He's been to this forum before, but so we can only do a second-hand job of kind of explaining the very difficult, very, very tough labor of love that they do on the ground out there. I mostly sit in an office in New York. That was it.
That's your opening case.
Yeah. So we were under some pressure so I have 5 minutes. You don't have a clock though. I can see one up there though. But
You're 40 seconds into your 5 minutes.
Good. A long time ago, many years ago, we said there was kind of a fad about investing in agriculture and in sub-Saharan Africa, and we said, what could we do there? And I found that the problems were not that difficult to see. The land was fragmented and difficult to find. The roads were terrible. The politics were worse. There was very poor seed and seed knowledge. Inputs were expensive and often not well distributed or financeable. Even frankly, the knowledge of the farmers tended to be poor. Processing was a mess. Distribution of the final product was a mess. I mean, there's basically nothing to like about sub-Saharan agriculture. And it's not that complicated to figure out why it's the mess that it is. It's just not been invested in. And so we said, is there something that we could do? And as you know, there's a long history of NGO, government, large project type investment occurring in some of these more challenging areas. But is there actually a model that would work for a private organization? And in order to survive the process, we couldn't make it too big. And if it was too small, there was no way for us to write a check and be able to manage it and make things actually happen. Because if you're going to build a road, it's a lot of money. If you're going to develop a new seed, it's a lot of money. And so it's got to be big enough to be worth that scale of investment. So we settled on a model that combined a centralized asset that we could invest in for a return with, from the start, an ambition to bring in a whole bunch of smallholders in that valley into the competitiveness benefits that we were creating by investing in those areas. And so that was our model. Let's create staying power, create focus by writing big checks to one big commercial farm, and let's involve thousands of farmers around it to share in that investment in the greater prosperity that can be achieved. I don't think we can win this debate, but all of you, if you're here, it's because you care about the underdog. So my real challenge here is to go for the sympathy vote. So the investment I'll put aside because the investment is an investment, right? So it's not a cost, it's generating money, or I should say will generate money, because we are 7 years into this and we have certainly not made a penny of profit. It's a large investment, and over the years, Norfund, DFID, represented by AgDevCo, and we hope very soon, in fact, the IFC should be joining us in that very large piece of infrastructure that we've built, again, focusing on our centralized 15,000 acres in this middle of Tanzania. To give you some numbers, so the smallholder program, which started almost from the start, so we now have data going back to 2010. We basically took the SRI methods in India and we started training and adapting them to the Tanzanian context, mainly again for rice farming that we're doing there. And we trained 15 farmers. The next year we did 250. The following year, 1,162. The following year, 2,850. The following year, 2,250, etc. And so we now have approximately 7,300 smallholders, again, not associated directly with the farm, but in our general valley that have gone through SRI. And the results are, I would call this randomized controlled trials light, because there are some issues with the data, but there's a lot of effort into tracking, surveying, and understanding what's going on. And the results are that these farmers typically have a few acres, and they've devoted 0.9 acres on average to our methods. And in the last season, 224 acres that were surveyed, for instance, out of a particular sample, generated more yield, more product in absolute terms than 680 acres that were still under traditional cultivation in that same area. The numbers are that if you look at the total cost, and again, I'm putting aside our investment, which is for a return, I'm putting it to the side, because that's not a cost, it's an investment. We have spent $1.695 million, much of it in kind, not actually in cash, much of it in kind, on these smallholder programs. And again, achieved somewhere close to a 3 times yield enhancement, even greater when you go to the more advanced zero-till type versions that we've done. And that factors to under $200 per farmer, and somewhere between a doubling and a quintupling of their prosperities as farmers, also measured in a very, very real way. So farmers going from subsistence to, in fact, having considerable amounts of surplus resources and cash.
Great, thank you.
So don't start. I'm going to stand up because the squishy nonprofit guys need to intimidate the for-profit guys somehow. Great. So I'd like to start with an example. In 2005, Root Capital made a $95,000 loan to a Ugandan coffee farmer cooperative called Gumatindo. And when we met, Gumatindo was already a darling of the fair trade movement. They'd organized 2,500 farmers and had already established a relationship with lead buyers here in the UK, but they still couldn't access a loan from a local bank. And so they really struggled without access to finance. They struggled to purchase the crop. And they generated less than $500,000 in revenue that first year, with the farmers side selling to the local middlemen, right? So Root Capital's loan was risky. The co-op had a very weak management structure. It had no fixed assets to offer as collateral, and the income revenue on that loan was just a fraction of the cost to underwrite the loan. Okay, so a decade later, Root Capital's lending Gumutin to $1 million a year. The organization has quadrupled its membership to 10,000 farmers, and they've increased their revenue eightfold. And here's the kicker. A couple of years ago, once the business had substantially grown, right, and they could take on larger loans, and they had real assets to offer as hard collateral, a local bank began lending alongside us. In other words, that is to say, once the nonprofit organization working on the financial frontier where capital is scarce and impact is abundant, once that happened, and we had successfully enabled the organization to grow and we de-risked the enterprise, the commercial for-profit lender came in and did what you'd expect to do, which was take very little risk and generate moderate incremental impact. So my headline, beware the for-profit, the false promise that you can generate market returns for the hardest to solve problems, especially in the smallholder agricultural space. The fact is, my friends, that neither agriculture nor small business in the United States or Europe is anywhere close to fully commercial or for-profit. Right? For over a century, the United States government has created the enabling environment for agriculture, from crop insurance to the farm credit system to the cooperative extension system, which provides America's farmers for over 100 years with best-in-class training and all sorts of other supports for investing in small businesses and in low-income neighborhoods through the Community Reinvestment Act. None of this exists in sub-Saharan Africa, right, where governments spend roughly not even 5% of national budgets on agriculture, even though it represents the primary economic activity for 70% of the population. Massive underinvestment in agriculture has left the continent decades behind other developing regions. And as a result, and this is critical to our argument, smallholder farmers have virtually none of the requisite infrastructure, right? Farm inputs, credit technology for getting to commercial. So the reality today is that for commercial and for-profit players are nowhere near the smallholder market. And if it's an agri-food company, for instance, that's involved, they're typically, it's an extractive situation. They're just pulling resources out. You take cocoa industry in West Africa, where for decades they've been mining resources as if mining gold, right? They're going for the cheapest product without investing in long-term quality and of supply, evacuating the crop as if the cocoa industry were one giant vacuum cleaner with its machinery kind of designed to clean out the farmers. And the industry is now being forced to develop alternative sources in Indonesia and beyond and in the laboratories. The private sector knows that there's a crisis, but it's reluctant to invest because the problems seem overwhelming and beyond their core focus on profitability and market share, and because competitors might come in and reap the benefits from their investments. So the goal of pre-competitive, rather pre-commercial collaboration remains elusive. And the promise of shared value has not been achieved. But here's the rub. What the nonprofit can do, especially the entrepreneurial social enterprise, is develop in the context of pre-commercial markets pathways for growth and scale that maximize the social benefit and minimize subsidy on the road to commercial viability. Nonprofits can add by far the most value as innovators and connectors in pre-commercial markets, creating blueprints for collaboration across a diversity of actors, brokering public-private partnerships, and leveraging a blend of commercial capital and smart subsidy with a markets orientation. Nonprofits can focus not just on purchasing goods, but rather on making the entire ecosystem and the supply chain work for farmers, work for communities, work for the earth, and ultimately work for all of us. So, my friends, in order to improve outcomes, I would absolutely invest your precious $1 million investment, outcomes for smallholder farmers, in innovating, in a nonprofit that's innovating and connecting in pre-commercial markets, right, and clearing pathways to commercial viability. And the for-profit alternative I'm afraid is just a false promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. It's your turn, Alan.
So, since my esteemed opponent wanted to prove that for-profit is a false promise, I'm hopeful that the showcase that I'm going to tell you about in Suminter India Organics will help to disprove that case. Suminter works by connecting remote agricultural farmlands in India and Africa to Western markets such as the US and the EU. You notice the name, they focus on the organic side of the market, which means they organize about 21,000 disenfranchised smallholder farmers in India into organic co-ops, thereby allowing the organic premium to be passed to the farmers. In that instance, that allows them to increase the farmer per income increase per year if you measure it versus other farmers in the region that they operate, especially in Gujarat. So we invested into Suminter in the fall of 2009. And at the time, the company was generating about $5 million in revenue. Since then, they have increased their revenue to about 14 times that number at tracing about $70 million this year and on track to reach $100 million in the near future. You can see that a lot of the sustainability on the resource side relates to the capital efficiency of the model because they organize these farmers together, and they also provide free pesticide and fertilizers to these farmers, thereby allowing the farmers to save about 33% in the cost of farming. And for those of you that are familiar with rural India, you understand that it's typically very difficult for these smallholder farmers to go to the villages, to go to the middlemen to sell the crop. If you're of a different religion, if you're of a different social status, often you get squeezed by these middlemen. In contrast, Suminter works with these farmers. They pick up at the farm gate, so that saves another 4% for the farmers from transportation cost. And you know how expensive diesel can be in India. It also allows the farmers to sell directly to Suminter right at the farm gate. So it's much more efficient on that basis that the farmers can actually start to operate and farm, do their work on farming as opposed to go to the villages and try to sell to the middlemen. So if we roll all that up and say, if we look at how that impacts the farmers on a farm income basis, if you look at the average farmer in India, they typically subsist on about $1,300 per year in US dollars. In the region that Suminter operates in Gujarat, typically farmers are slightly more well off because it's got great agronomics, and that's about $1,600 per year. For these farmers that work with Suminter, they earn about $2,260 per year on average. That means all of these cost savings that I mentioned to you earlier, from organic premium to savings on fertilizers and pesticides, not having to buy GM seeds, which saves you about 50%, and not having to travel to the village to sell your product and instead have Suminter pick it up from you, that means about a 42% increase in farmer income for the farmers that work with Suminter. I want to highlight that because in addition to the capital sufficiency, where Suminter only raised about $9 million in equity funding and is now generating on an ongoing basis an ever-increasing revenue that's about to reach $100 million, they're able to generate this type of increase in farmers' income on a per-year basis. Suminter has also focused on social progress in its rural communities by using some of its capital to construct community centers, bus stands, crematoriums. And so we know that they focus on the impact on the lives of the farmers as much as they focus on increasing just the farm income for these farmers that they work with. So for those of you that were raising both your right hands and your left hands earlier, I would submit to you that we can find for-profit investments that have social impacts that can create resource sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Ladies and gentlemen, so I think we basically may want to concede the general point that if we're talking about general agriculture, that the for-profit sector is much larger, obviously, than the nonprofit sector, and may do a lot of work. But what I would argue is that if we're talking about pro-poor development and for the poorest populations in the world, that the nonprofit sector is a much more direct and cost-effective way to achieve those pro-poor outcomes. So let's define who we're talking about. In East Africa, in the market that I work, our farm families subsist not on more than $1,000 per year, but more in the range of $500 to $800 of total household income per year. If you're looking at only cash income and not the value of crops, we have many households that subsist on, there's literally $200 of cash that actually comes and goes in the door every day. Many of our families suffer from an annual hunger season, and hunger plays a role in the majority of child deaths. 1 in 10 of our children die before they reach age 5. 40% of surviving children suffer from a lifetime of physical and mental stunting from pure calorie deficiency. This is a market that is 240 million undernourished people. It's the most extreme form of poverty on the planet. They're not even eating enough calories to survive. And this, actually, the project in Tanzania is one of the very few I've heard of that is actually has profit potential that could help this actual population. So that, I think if we're talking about achieving outcomes for that population, I think the most direct and cost-effective way is a nonprofit organization. My organization, 1 Acre Fund, we serve 250,000 farm families with a package of farm inputs, finance, training, and market facilitation. And it's not a pure aid program. It has elements of a for-profit program in it. We generate revenue, and the majority of our revenues come from farmers. It does cost us a donor input of about $25 per year per farmer. So it certainly costs more money, but in terms of achieving outcomes for the extreme poorest populations, I think it's pretty clear that the far more direct and cost-effective way is for nonprofit organizations to do that. I think also that there is a great argument that, to build on what Willie was saying, that nonprofits sort of set up customers to be eligible for the for-profit market where they can continue to flourish and thrive. I think the beauty of capitalism is that it's like dumb cows go to water, like money. I'm not calling you guys dumb cows. Or am I? The beauty of capitalism is that money flows to where profit can be made. And once the nonprofit system or government subsidies have set up extremely poor people to basically be able to thrive in a capitalist system, that's when capitalism comes in and takes over and makes all the difference. But in those very early stages of development, for very, very poor people, I think there's no real alternative to the nonprofit model. Our average transaction per farmer is $80, which, just to give you a sense, is even 4 times smaller than a typical microfinance loan in East Africa. There's no way that capitalists would be interested in this target population. So thank you for your consideration, and I think we now have like rebuttals or something like that?
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you, Andrew. Short and sweet, thanks. Do you guys want a few minutes to prepare? You go for it. Okay. Another 4 or 5 minutes. Round 2.
Round 2. I'm standing up this time.
So I sent all the data I had to my colleagues well before we started today. I haven't received anything back.
This is a no-phone environment, actually. We're trying to focus on the interactions.
Yes. No. Now, look, clearly, I'll do this a little separately. Willie model is wonderful, but it's a for-profit model, really. And so the parts that I like about it, at least, are all the lending parts, which I don't know what lending is if it's not for profit, right? At least for
High risk, low return,
low, yes, something like that. I think if you look at our smallholder program, it is very, very similar in a lot of ways to what Anchor Fund does. About an acre per smallholder. The incomes are probably roughly similar. What we can't, if you look at the scale today, there's no comparison, right? We've spent tens of millions on a farm and trained, what is now approaching 10,000 smallholders, whereas they've trained and brought seed and fertilizer to a much, much larger group. I think the difference, though, to understand is that when you put all that money in one spot and you focus it, you develop a staying power and a critical mass that is completely different than seeing some field person come through and help some farmers and may or may not show up again for months or years. And so the reason I think it's so effective to do this with a large focusing investment in the center of these agricultural regions in the world is that it guarantees that follow-through will be there. And it serves as a place for the work to be there, for the field agents to live and collaborate, for the inputs to be improved. I still struggle a little bit with how these nonprofit models, the softer they get, in the end, who builds the roads? Who builds the irrigation? Who actually develops the seed the farmers need? Who puts in bulk contracts to lower and improve the cost of fertilizer? All these things that we do and we can share, not at a cost, but frankly as an increased benefit to our centralized farm. That's where I don't see it. So what it leaves me with is, yes, the only real weakness I see in a model like ours is the fact that it takes a lot more money to build that focus, to build that central farm, and it's difficult because you don't find 15,000 acre parcels in most of these agriculturally fertile areas, right? That's probably the hardest part. But in a funny way, once you are successful, it's easier to raise these larger sums than it is sometimes to raise the smaller sums that are needed to go address these tens and hundreds of millions of people around the world that have very, very similar problems. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jan. All right, well, so a lot of what I was going to say he just said in terms of my key points, but I'll just maybe be redundant here, which is tens of millions spent on more than a few thousand farmers, but certainly not hundreds of thousands of farmers, I think speaks to an important issue around what underwrites SROI. The staying power of a farm when it's for profit depends on whether it's profitable. So sooner or later, you either make it profitable or you don't. So yes, there's staying power, but it depends on whether you're profitable. And it's not profitable yet, but it's a noble endeavor, no question. I want to pick up on Andrew's comments around impact and outcome and the kind of populations that we're talking about. There are two words that are really, I want you to remember. Additionality matters. And you as the audience, and I think the referees of this debate, should measure the social return on your precious $1 million investment based on three factors. And the first one is the number of people reached, right? And let's be honest, that's where most people stop, right? Especially for profits, number of people reached. Next one is degree of benefit experienced per person. What's the depth and what's the type of the impact? Really study that, especially when we're talking about these most vulnerable populations. The third is the degree of need, right, per person. So the poorest need $1 more, and so $1 to them is much higher SROI to us, for instance. So for factors 2 and 3, degree of benefit and degree of need, this is where the counterfactual really matters. It needs to be a benefit that wouldn't have otherwise happened, right? Your $1 million investment should not serve a market that would have otherwise been served. And the last time I checked, 500 million small-scale farmers in the world, the vast, vast majority, almost all of them, live and work in pre-commercial markets, right? There are 35 million out of the 500 million who are working in commercial markets and in tighter supply chains. And hence our argument that nonprofits can add much more collective value than for-profits, given this gargantuan need for capital and for building better livelihoods, that innovating and connecting in these pre-commercial markets and clearing pathways for commercial viability through smart public-private partnerships so that you don't have to lay money on the table in terms of who's going to pay for the agricultural research for certified seed, or who's going to build the roads and so on. And leveraging that blend of capital, commercial capital, with smart subsidy with a market orientation. Clearly the operational costs, as Andrew mentioned, are much higher when you're serving those most vulnerable populations across, depending on the sector, could be micro entrepreneurs, could be youth at risk, and in particular for smallholder farmers. But if you include all three inputs into SROI, number of people reached, and the degree of benefit and the degree of need, I think the calculation weighs heavily in favor of nonprofits. You can find a few, you can cherry pick a few projects here and there, but generally I think that's the case. And so it's really simple. Think about 1 Acre's model and how much of their expenses they cost with interest or with revenue earned, and yet they're serving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of farmers. If we can find a for-profit model for a 1 Acre fund, then I think we'll just hand you the debate. That's my first point. The next one is very quick, which is there are dangers lurking in this debate. And look what happened in microfinance in Andhra Pradesh in India. Andhra Pradesh showed us the dangers when not having SROI clearly in place, not taking into account number of people and a particular degree of benefit and degree of need. So-called mission-driven for-profit financial institutions, right? They flooded into the market, created a market bubble, over-indebted countless borrowers across the countryside. In other words, an obsessive focus on reaching number of people led to lack of accountability around degree of benefit and the degree of need. And as we've seen, that led to a regulatory backlash from the government, which has basically crowded out the institutions that are most focused on the least served socioeconomic segment. So today, ultimately, there's far less access in Andhra Pradesh to capital as a result of the for-profit, so-called mission-driven focus. So conclusion, it can be counterproductive, and I would submit, dangerous for you all if you don't focus on the $1 million investment on SROI that embodies number of people as well as degree of benefit and of need. And then lastly, additionality matters, and here's a key, governance. These guys are nice guys. I've known them pretty well. They're super nice guys. But the governance structure of a nonprofit is a forcing mechanism that requires you to question and then re-question whether the entity is on mission and whether the SROI is actually creating impact, right? The for-profit forcing mechanism is return. And if you're not hitting a return, guess what? These guys are going to be out of there. I don't think we can afford that given how precious this $1 million investment is and what the stakes are. Thanks.
So I would argue that we're seeing a new class of investors emerging, and we're hopeful that we'll see more of these types of investors who focus also on SROI as opposed to purely return. I think it's evidenced by the continual deployment of capital into agriculture would be a good example. If you look at the capital that's gone into Suminta, while it's profitable, it hasn't met all of its revenue projections. So it's a great focus to find the right type of corporate governance. And I think if you see this lapel badge, that we're seeing this emergence of this new investor class that's starting to look at both social benefits as well as financial returns whenever the investments are made, as evidenced by some of you that raise both your right hands and your left hands. Imagine if, given the $9 million that's been raised by Suminta on the equity side, if you had deployed more capital into it and 10 more Sumintas around, that's generating these 70 to 100 million in revenue per year. But also it's resulting in farmers' income of 42% per year gain on per farmer basis. And if you aggregate that, that's about 15 million for the 21,000 farmers that they work with. That translates into about $650 per year on a per farmer basis. Think about the impact that has on these farmers' lives and the staying power, to Jan's point, of these corporations, especially in the case of Suminta, given that it's financially profitable, what they're doing is they're expanding into other geographic areas. So they're starting to expand into Africa and organizing some of the farmers into organic co-ops in the same model that they have been doing so successfully in Gujarat. So I think my point is that we will be able to find both for-profit investments that can achieve capital sustainability, resource sustainability, and also impact the farmers' lives positively. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll also, again, be brief, but just want to make two general points. First is, I think actually we have here two specimens of unusually benevolent capitalists. And as this fellow in a necktie here has indicated, has sort of hinted, maybe it seems that Capricorns may be giving up a little bit on profitability in order to achieve social outcomes. So arguably, really, the amount of social impact these guys are having is precisely because they're wearing two hats. Their capitalist hat, but also maybe a little bit of their like hippies on the inside, you know? So I would argue that maybe some of that hippiness is causing their actual impact. It's not their inherent capitalism, actually. But anyways, we could run through the economics of that business some other times, probably. The other argument I would say is just go back to Willie's absolutely brilliant framework, which is how many people are being reached, what's the degree of need, and what's the degree of incrementality, how much are we changing their lives? And I think what we're showing, traditional thinking is that for-profit's the only way to be big, But I think what our organizations show, Willie lends like $100 million plus a year. He's lent more than $1 billion of capital in the existence of Root Capital. And it's just one organization. My organization is also just one organization. And I think what we're showing is that the world can be a different place, It's not just for-profits that can be big. Also, nonprofit organizations can be very large. So let's debunk the traditional thinking and let's say, nonprofits can also be big and of significant scale. In terms of degree of need, I think it's admirable that these hippie capitalists are also going into some of these more needy markets. But it's you guys have to admit, it's a pretty rare thing. There's not many that are actually seriously investigating these markets. But this is our bread and butter. This is what attracts us. And Willie points out, this is our governance forces us to deliberately focus on incredibly unprofitable markets. And then, of course, there's degree of incrementality. I think when you're talking about extremely poor populations that suffer very high child death rates and just have very high need, the amount that a very, very small amount of increased farm profit can be utterly transformative for people's lives. You go from spending 80% of your time and resources acquiring food to, for the first time, having a food surplus and actually investing a little bit in your future, and slowly building a path out of poverty and being able to make investments. So I think when you look at just kind of number of people reached, I think the nonprofit sector can be very big. You look at the target market that we serve and the degree of incrementality, there's really no question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, I guess it's the moment of truth here. So we'll do another vote, but I just want to say, I said at the beginning that I have the privilege of association with these guys, and I feel so good that privilege I was able to share, they were able to share with all of you. You got to feel the same way I do. It's just amazing what the Skoll Foundation and Capricorn is doing. So we're going to make a distinction, though. I want to see if they were able to sway your way of thinking. That's really the point. So, counters, help me.
Are you going to open it up for some?
Yeah. I want to do the vote, and then we can end with the discussion.
No. Let us discuss.
No, you're not debating.
We have to ask questions. I'm not clear on some of the things they said.
Do you want to do that? We've got about 5 minutes.
Yeah. Then once I'm clear, then I'll raise my vote.
Are you guys? Are you up to be challenged?
We could have plants in the audience.
Yes, that's true. But I trust you. You would never. Well, actually, I know you, so. And he's on your side. Well, you use both hands. Okay. Do you want to do 5 minutes of questions? Okay. Madhav, do you have something that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, it seems to me that the lines are getting blurred. So both my hands are right now up both. The reason I'm saying that is not-for-profit and for-profit is not very clear. Both are revenue models. Now, in one case, I suspect for the for-profit, you're saying we are committed to giving dividends or something to the investors, and in your case, you're probably not giving dividends. Is that the essential difference between the two? Or are you for loss? You're not for loss, are you? You are not for profit, but are you for loss? Which means that capital has to be continuously pumped in, which can be that. I think the distinction between the two will probably make me decide.
Well, I guess the way I would respond to that reflection is that I think that the market failure is so deep, and let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, relative to, say, in the United States or Europe, as I mentioned, with so much scaffolding and smart subsidy over the years, enabling our farmers to, produce food and so on, is that I think we're the nonprofit, which is it's a tax status, not a business model per se, but the nonprofit has the ability to create a ton of leverage by creating blueprints for collaboration amongst government, amongst the corporate sector, amongst NGOs, innovation labs for good ideas, and bringing the blended capital. You're not going to have an Uncle Sam that's going to pay for all of these things, so you have to bring those different actors together. And I would argue if you've got $1 million to invest, the kryptonite capital is being able to create that blueprint and bring those dollars together. So, this is a terrific investment they've made in Tanzania, but they shouldn't have to spend all the money that they have as a for-profit investor when it really, you need a village. You need to bring in those different players and have commercial capital, yes, with a blend of smart subsidy with a market orientation. To me, that's the great change agent of our time.
You guys want to respond to that?
I only say, and it's not really a response, it's a different answer, which is it takes large amounts of capital to upgrade uncompetitive agriculture. And I understand that some of this can be done by enabling farmers to be more productive with what they have, and that creates very quick dividends to those farmers. But in the end, for that agriculture to truly be competitive on a global scale, which is increasingly harder and harder, not getting easier, someone needs to make those investments. And so even though the agri-type model employs a lot more capital, by showing that by investing $1,000 per acre into infrastructure that you can actually make a return, it ends up, when you prove that case, it ends up being a lot easier to raise the many billions you need globally to continue to do that than models that use a little bit of capital to affect a large group of people, but without a model of how and who is going to spend all that serious money to build infrastructure. And so I understand that this path is more capital intensive and doesn't deliver the same people for the bank. But once it's established, it can channel very, very large sums of money that are non-philanthropic monies into doing the same in other places. And it's difficult, but I think it is a necessary complementary approach.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, so sorry to jump in, but I have another dimension of this that I think is really important, which is we're sort of taking snapshots, and we're talking about revenue generation and farmers and productivity, but the reality is they're land managers. And so I would love to know between these two models, when you think about really long-term sustainability, that's carbon in the soils, that's quality of water, availability of water, that's the diversity of the gene pool, all of those kinds of things. And I worry about that because you introduced the session by saying, we got to produce 4 times more agricultural products than we had in the past, and we have 10 billion people on the planet, and it's only one planet. So in my mind, it's almost less about it's obviously about the farmer and moving out of poverty, but that piece of land needs to be around for a long, long time. Which of these approaches ensures that kind of long game,
Particular case that all of these models are fairly environmentally sustainable, actually. I think you made the point that just general, being in one area for a long time and having a multi-year relationship generally incentivizes both NGOs and companies to care about long-term results. So for example, we have a strong initiative in One Acre Fund called Long-Term Impact, where we monitor soil quality over long periods of time, and composting, we're putting a lot of effort into that, building soil carbons and things like that. And my sense is that all of these projects actually were working for many years. I would say that is a little unusual in the for-profit sector, like for an investor to care more about kind of these long-term results.
Can I build just two quick comments? So to the point around corporates and leveraging the power of, say, global supply chains around sustainable natural products, there's a ton of investment that's happening and then can happen with a Walmart or Costco sourcing Brazil nuts from the Amazon, or in our case, we're working closely with both companies in cashew in West Africa. But they very much need to have a whole array of partners that help to crowd in around all of those needs that are beyond their focus, which is creating a market and focusing on market share and profitability. But that's one really important partner in the value chains in those global supply chains, where you can get not just the productivity constraints around soil depletion and poor natural resources and so on, lack of inputs, lack of technology, but the other ones, which are around how, what are the competitive forces, what to grow, when to sell it, right? All of the infrastructure issues, and that's the second one, which is aggregators, small businesses, growing farmer cooperatives or private enterprises, and that's where you come into another reality, which we have to face, which is small businesses in the United States benefit from a ton of subsidy from the government. You get guarantees from the SBA, the Small Business Administration. You get a ton of subsidy wrapped around, because that's where most net new jobs come from in our country. So to build small businesses that can address for farmer managers, land managers at a huge scale, the issues you're talking about, or tapping into those larger global value chains, the big agri-food companies who desperately need resiliency on the other end of their supply chain, I do think it takes a continuum of capital. One end, 100% risk-adjusted market returns. Other end, negative 100%. The blend of those, I think, gets us to being able to address those concerns.
Sounds like a lot of the questions were also about soil sustainability and how the land managers, in the Syminter case, it's about how the farmers manage. So to get to that long-term farmer income increase and the productivity for the organic method for Syminter, the first few years they actually suffer in productivity if they switch from GMO seeds to actually and stop using sort of non-organic fertilizers. So it requires that sort of profitable Syminter type of model, and the farmers typically can't organize themselves as well and efficiently. So Syminter has got that down to the science of grouping the farmers together, getting them into an organic co-op. And in that case, they take the upfront hit of the crop productivity, and then to be later on such that they can save 50% on not buying GM seeds. They save 30% from not having used the non-organic fertilizers. And then on top of that, they benefit from the organic premium, which is generally around 10% over the crop prices.
Another question?
Yeah, I had a question about the revenue generating nonprofit model, specifically for 1 Acre Fund.
Thanks. So you mentioned that when you're increasing farmland, you're increasing revenue per farmer, but as you mentioned that you have about 250,000 farm families, and it requires a donor input of $25 per year per farmer to sustain that. So I guess you would have 6.25 million of expenses every year, and if you tried to expand that, that would only increase your losses. So do you require a business model that requires you to increase your farmer revenue to the point where that $25 per farmer per year goes down to zero to sustain it and to scale?
Yeah, I mean, nonprofit models do require ongoing sustained donor input in general. We do have some markets where we could have a reasonable hope of breaking even, but we do require that donor input. And I think, again, I would challenge the philanthropy markets to be better. Like, $6 million in the grand scheme of things of the world is like a drop in the bucket. And philanthropy markets, I think, are responding and seeking those really high social returns, and the amount of money available for nonprofits to grow is becoming steadily bigger and bigger. And, the foundation, for example, is helping to lead that as well. Akiva is helping to bring new kinds of capital into the world and kind of challenging the traditional way of doing philanthropy. And I think what we're showing is that $6 million is nothing. I mean, we can really mobilize a ton of capital if it's impactful.
That story that I started with, Gumutindo, darling of the fair trade movement when we started working with them 10 years ago. And then it wasn't until years later that a commercial bank, forget about the hippie capitalists, a commercial bank came in and said, okay, you've basically de-risked it. It's the size and kind of strength that I'm willing to finance it. Just to pull way back, the 50,000 feet, that farmer cooperative is within the 35 million small-scale farmers in the world who are in tight value chains with export cash crop value chain type of dynamics. There's another 165 million who are, quasi-commercial, barely surplus farmers in very loose supply chains. Think millet, sorghum, maybe sold into local markets. And then there are 300 million farmers who are non-surplus and non-commercial. So the need to come up with models that basically allow many, many, many more millions to become subject to the cherry picking for profit models is so massive that we've got to come up with creative ways to bring in capital that's that blended capital. Otherwise, we're just going to be cherry picking in this tiny, tiny little niche of a market of like export organic mangoes or something. We've got to come up with ways that are public-private partnerships to bring in the capital that's required because it's such a deeply failed market.
By the way, one quick thing on your question. So in Agrica's case, it was founded by, the CEO is the founder of the Tanzanian Forest Conservation Group. We're operating in an incredibly sensitive area, base of the Dzungwa mountain range. And it was in fact founded as a company because it is the only possible hope that this whole area doesn't get deforested, is that there be high-intensity agriculture that make the people who live there sufficiently prosperous that they don't go chop trees down. And a lot of the work that was done in his prior organization is to teach these communities that they own the forest, it's their asset, and that they should be good stewards of it. So I don't really see, yes, in the areas where you are cultivating intensively, there are certainly strong impacts on the land, but I think those can be managed. And we live in our countries with, in many places, a balance between good business and being good stewards of the environment, at least locally, not on a global scale. And that's really the only hope for some of these areas. I mean, very poor, uneducated, extremely populated areas don't make very good stewards of the land.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Go ahead. And then
Oh, this is great. Thank you guys very much. I'm thinking about water, and I'm thinking about the capital markets and water. And I'm assuming that it's probably pretty similar in agriculture in terms of it's incredibly fragmented. So I'm curious, I think maybe your sector, the agricultural sector, might be a little bit more mature in that I'm curious, what's the connectivity? And we're talking about a continuum of capital. What's the connectivity between the nonprofits, the social entrepreneurship models, the concessionary, non-concessionary to concessionary, all the way up to the capital markets, right? You say like the non-hippie sort of investors, right? So like, is there a network? What's the community of practice? How do people talk to each other? When do you know that, we've graduated from 1 Acre Fund, now we're ready to go to SME funding, now we're ready to go to, like, what's the graduation of the people we're trying to serve, and how are the organizations within that continuum working together so we can pass deals along that continuum? It's a little bit of an oversimplified metaphor, but I'm just curious, like in the agricultural sector, how's that working? Because in water, we're completely not talking to each other in terms of private equity, nonprofits. There's just a huge gap in between.
I'll start. With respect to water, you want to know, or with respect to just agriculture, or the connective tissue between the two issues?
The connective tissue between the two issues.
Okay, that's a tough one. So this is what I'd say. So just an example which maybe reinforces some of the arguments we've been making, because we are in a debate here. I'm on the external advisory panel for sustainability of Keurig Green Mountain, which was formerly Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, now it's Keurig Green Mountain. And it has a 17% equity stake now from Coca-Cola, and they're really focusing on the issue of water. And water, both on the manufacturing side of the United States, and you all know that, or if you've read anything about it, the K-Cup, right, of their brewing system is highly controversial in terms of sustainability. But with respect to water, they're really focusing on 3 things on the ground with their suppliers. 1, whole farm planning, so the issues that Michael raised around whole farm holistic planning for land managers. Thing 2, water stewardship, i.e. landscape kind of management and looking at the local watersheds in coffee country. And 3, strong rural enterprises. How do you invest in, why do I mention this as an example in terms of the continuum? Because the only way they're going to be able to make any difference is focusing on them providing guaranteed market for that product, and then having a proliferation of partners, nonprofit partners, on the ground, maybe for profit over time, but that are helping to pump and prime production in the context of those 3 priorities. So very much focusing in on organizations like Water for People and Water.org and so on how do you crowd in this kind of mosaic of partners to address the issues lurking that are mitigating against resilience at the other end of their supply chain, and them focusing on their 2 fundamental priorities as not a hippie capitalist, but a for-profit Coca-Cola kind of capitalist, which is market share and profitability, because that's what's going to drive their company. So I think it's a good example where there's this whole continuum of players that kind of go all the way up to that end buyer. One other thing I'd say is just there's a huge trend right now toward corporates, like I mentioned, Walmart, Costco, Unilever making big sustainability commitments, and then kind of saying, oh my gosh, how do I do this? And they're crowding in with the nonprofits on the ground who've got the experience to help them to kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Let's take 2 more questions over here then.
Thanks.
I think you got the mic there.
Thank you. Just preparing for vote. And if this discussion was in another room with farmers, maybe they will have a different opinion that we will have. I spent a few years on rural development in Latin America. And on an average position, I prefer an average NGO than an average private enterprise as a rural farmer. Why? Because the history of private enterprises, especially in agribusiness, is an horrible history. Take the case of banana or rice or sugar cane. Private enterprise was the main reason to expropriate the main assets of the poor, that's been the land, to expropriate the water, to expropriate the labor force, to create horrible situations. And that's why many farmers will vote against a private enterprise following this history. But on the other side, many farmers will vote for a responsible and serious private inclusive enterprise instead of an average NGO. And that's the new experience in the region. And the main reason is because a private enterprise is sharing the risk of the poor and is really on the reality, living in the reality, and not selling ideologic models of training processes or whatever the donors want. The main claim for many farmers today is if NGOs share the risk with us, if the revenues of the NGOs come from the revenues of our activity, we will share with an NGO. But if we still have the old model in which we have donors on one side, and the main reason to do things for an NGO is to have the donor happy, nothing to do with the quality of life of the small farmers. That's why, in my condition of not real farmer representative, I will vote for the private enterprise of the good Guarani.
Listen to this man.
I knew there was a plan. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, after
Micha will have the last question.
After listening, I'm not sure whether what I'm about to say is a question or a statement. I've been doing this for 40 years, and whatever you do, if you do not have capital formation, you will have to keep on asking for somebody to give you money, and they get sick of it. Believe me, Skoll will get sick of you too. Even the British Empire didn't last. So that the first one is that I think you need to do both the profit and the non-profit, but not so much non-profit, but maximization of profit and optimization of profit. You can't have non-profit because you go bankrupt unless somebody bails you out. And again, you cannot expect to live off the generosity of others forever. I would say that there must be capital formation, there must be cost recovery, there must be some surplus, otherwise you can't expand. So I would suggest that you have two. One is you have a maximization of profit, the other one, or or half, you can have a dozen. Or the other one is optimization of profit. We do the same thing for the last 40 years. In fact, we've never had to borrow except for the first time 40 years ago. And we've used the capital to expand. We have a very simple rule that profits can be used for reserve, capital expansion, business expansion, and charitable activities to our non-profit arm. For instance, if you want to know what a good profit-making arm or maximization profit, you just go to a nearby town called Blister. There's a restaurant called Cabbages and Condoms there. It's now in England as well, Japan. But it all began with just one company where it maximized profit, and then it became optimization profit. And that one has helped to expand about 28 others. So I would say that what you're doing is good, but have two of many things. You have two of many things, right? So you can have both maximization and optimization profit, because without capital formation, there's not much you can do. Thank you.
Do you want to make a comment?
I'll make a brief comment on that one. I think it ties back to the other gentleman's remark, which is, look, the reality is that agriculture is nowhere near fully commercial and for-profit in the richest countries in the world. There's a lot of scaffolding and subsidy, whether we see it or whether we want to admit it's there. So it's just a question of how do you come up with the right vehicles and mechanisms where you can maximize social benefit, you can minimize the amount of subsidy that's required, and really hold yourselves to the highest standards in order on the road to commercial viability. And I think if we don't admit that we need to have that blended capital and not get distracted by the nonprofit word, but rather being able to create those collaborations, then we will wake up 50 years from now, not to mention 100 years from now, in a worse situation than we are now, which is we have 500 million small-scale farmers in the world living on less than $2 a day. Multiply that times 4 or 5, you're talking about almost a third of the population on Earth. We must come up with ways, and if we just think magically that, oh, for-profit, kind of dogmatically, for-profit, therefore capital creation. No, it's just coming up with ways to leverage the smart subsidy with the market orientation, with the commercial capital, in order to not leave those populations orphaned for the coming decades, because that's what they are right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're out of time. I don't need to take a vote, because I got everything that I've wanted for years from the preparation and the heart that you guys put into this. So before we vote, I just want to thank you so much. Would you join me in just... But we'll take the vote because I know it's important to you.
This is a great idea.
Yeah, fill out if it's a debate format. I don't know what else it would work. These are eminent practitioners. We are so fortunate. I mean it. It's even the hippie thing. Yeah. There's a lot of hippies in here, right? Are hippies at heart? Okay, let's take a vote. For profit. Did you guys count? Oh, I think something happened here. That's the for profit. Okay, nonprofit. Is it still? I think the nonprofit. Yeah, maybe there are less people voting twice. What did you guys get?
The nonprofit picked up a few votes.
I think the nonprofit picked up.
You count the abstentions?
It's a vote of pity.
Yeah. Yeah. They actually want they want a grant. That's what they want. They need money.
But how many would vote for the combination?
Oh, I think everybody would. The combination, yeah. All right. Nonprofit one. That's what I thought. Congratulations. You'll be back next year. Agrica needs to generate some profit. That's what I care about. Okay, everyone, thank you. Fill out your cards about a comment about the debate format as well as the content. Thank you very much. Thanks.